Hey everyone, and welcome to today's video on Redux. Today we're going to go over what Redux is, we're going to go over setting it up completely from scratch, and we're going to go over two cases. One is going to be a really simple case, and then we're going to expand the application to be a bit more complex so you guys can really see how Redux works and what its core uses are. Now, if you go to the Redux documentation, it's sort of tagline is a predictable state container for JS apps, and that could be a bit confusing, especially if you're a beginner in React and you've gone through all my previous React tutorials. You've sort of gotten to a point where you see how React works, but when you think about adding state management libraries like Redux or any other state management library you might have heard of like MobX, it might sound a bit confusing on what it does. And I personally don't think the homepage that pitches the toolkit sort of helps that much either. So I'm going to try and simplify things as much as possible. If I were to click getting started on this Redux page, you would see there are two different things you could do. Number one is you can install the whole Redux toolkit, or you can install the Redux core and pretty much build your app from scratch. In today's video, I'm going to show you guys how to do it from the Redux core, which will show you all the underlying workings behind Redux. And the Redux toolkit was really made so you wouldn't have to worry about the nitty-gritty details, but I think once you know about the nitty-gritty details and you set it up once, it's sort of going to be really good for you moving forward and setting it up again in the future. And just a reminder, if you find value in this video, please consider leaving a comment, liking, subscribing, and hitting that notification bell so you know every time I release a video. I can't tell you how much it helps with the YouTube algorithm, and it really helps get these videos out there to more and more people like yourself. So let's just jump straight into it. Redux, if you want an example of how it works, I've prepared this little paint explanation. So let's say that this is your React application right here. And in your React application, you can see I have a bunch of boxes here. Each one of these boxes, just like the first React application I made and the first tutorial we did, contains a different component. So let's say this is your header component, and then you have one component, the green box component, that contains a whole bunch of other components over here, like you see. Now, the thing about each one of these components is you already know that we can have, a React state variable, and that state variable will hold state within every single one of these components. But what happens if, for example, I wanted to get the state of the red component, let's say a state variable like count from the red component, and display it into this orange component? Let me get rid of some of these arrows so it's a bit easier to see again. I want to take a state variable, like let's say this red component is a counter, and I want to display the count from this red component inside of this orange component. Well, it gets a bit tricky because this red component is nested inside this green component. And then finally, the orange component is a sibling, so to speak, of this the orange component is a sibling of the green component. So it's a bit tricky to pass a variable all the way up from this red component to the green component. Then it would have to pass it to both of their parents' component, which is the black component, our overall component, and then from the black component back into the orange component. And cases like this before state management libraries came around were really difficult to deal with, and it made code very hard to understand, especially when you're passing things from component to component to component, it gets really messy. So state management libraries are the solution to that. And what a state management library does, something like Redux, is it will allow you to have a place that is separate from those components where you can store variables that all your components can access the same way. So let's say, for example, I wanted to store the count from the red component. Instead of storing it inside of this red component as a state variable, I would be able to store that count in my Redux store, and then whenever let me fix this. There we go. Whenever I need to use that count in any other component, well, my counter component simply pushes the count to our Redux store, and any other component can just easily access our Redux store, no matter what component that is. And that's what a state management library essentially is. It's a place where you can store a state variable and access it from any component very easily, so you don't have to worry passing variables from one component to its parent component, to its parent component, and then to a different child component. And you don't have to worry about none of that spaghetti code. Now, the central way a Redux works is through these three things. You have, number one, your actions, number 2, your reducers, and number 3, your actual state. Now, the state is probably the most intuitive one. The state is essentially where all the variables are stored. So the state is essentially just a map with a bunch of variables in it. For example, in our previous example, this component had a state variable. We stored a state variable called count in our state. Now, actions are things that our components are going to call in order to edit that state. And the things that actually edit that state are known as the reducer itself. So if we wanted to increment the count, our component would dispatch an action that we set up in our Redux component, or sorry, our Redux, our reducer, called increment. That increment would then call, that action would then trigger a function in our reducer called, increment, that would edit the state and store an incremented version of that count. And don't worry if you don't fully understand how this works right now. We're going to go into an example, and it's going to be super, super simple once you see it in action. And you'll see that the first step is we're going to npm I Redux. But before we get to that, I want to just have a little disclaimer. The way I like to set up my reducers is in something called a Dux pattern. Now, a Dux pattern for Redux is essentially just a file structure, a best practice file structure that somebody came up with because they got tired storing, all of their actions in one file, all of their reducers in one file, and their state in another file. It gets really messy really quick, especially when you're dealing with a big application where you have things going everywhere. So the way that they solved this was just by simply introducing this thing called a Dux method, D-U-C-K-S, and essentially all that is it's a way to put all your actions, your reducers, and your state all into one file. That's essentially all it is. It's just having everything in one file so it's easier to manage. It's not very complex, and once you see our example of how we do things, it'll become a lot more obvious on what we're doing. But if you are still confused, I made a video back in February of this year on the 2 best ways to structure your Redux apps, and I showed you in this video, I think over here, I'll link this video in the description, but I have a timestamp where I go over the Dux method, and if you're still a bit confused about it after this video, feel free to go and check that video out. I will leave the link in the description as well as the documentation for the Dux method. But anyways, let's jump straight into it. The first thing we're going to do is npm install Redux. Now, I'm going to be working on Code Sandbox as usual. If you are running from VS Code, go into terminal and type npm I Redux. Over here, we don't have to do that on Code Sandbox. I will just type in Redux, and you'll see here that Redux is a library that I just click it, and it'll add it to the package.json and automatically install it. Now, the application I have set up here, and don't worry, this Code Sandbox link will be available on in the description as well, so you can go ahead, fork it yourself, and play around with it. What I have here is just a very simple component, something that you've definitely seen before. All I have is my app.js that calls a counter, and that counter is essentially just a counter. It has an increment button where I can click and it will increment the count, and a decrement button where I can click and it will subtract 1 from the count. Now, the way that this component is set up is something that you've definitely probably seen before, especially if you've gone through my React tutorials. All we have is our component counter. Then we have a state that stores the counter, the count of our counter. Then, of course, we have our increment function, which will just set the count equal to count plus 1. We have our decrement function, which will set the count to be equal to count minus 1. And then all we're doing over here is we're returning some HTML to structure our count. So we have a div, and I made the background color gray just to make it a bit more easy. I might even add some margin. And if you watched our last video on creating a whole React application, you'll know that this is just inline styling. I'm just going to create a margin of 10 px. Whoops, I forgot to put a comma here. Here we go. And that'll make it so that if I have multiple counts, which we're going to do in the future, it'll sort of space these out. But yeah, then all I'm doing is I'm displaying the count, and then I have 2 buttons inside of this div, and I just made the display flex and justify content to be equal to center so that they're side by side. And obviously we have our increment button that just calls our increment function, and our decrement button that just calls our decrement function. And I hope this font size is okay for you guys. Now, what our goal is, our first Redux application, what we want to do is I want to display the count inside of our app component. And you can see here our app component actually calls the counter and has the counter nested. But what if I didn't want to display the count inside of the counter itself? What if I wanted to display it out here? So for example, if I uncomment this, you'll see over here I have some text that says the count, but nothing's here because we don't have access to that variable. Well, one way to do this without Redux is simply I can go ahead and create a count variable, count and set count, and then I can make that equal to react.useState, initialize it to 0. I can go ahead and say the count is count over here, and then if I want to go ahead and hook up our counter to our count variable, what I could do is simply this. I could do set count. I could pass in the set count function as a prop. And then in here, instead of having the count in here, and instead of displaying the count, I will just destructure the set count function from props. So const set count equals props. So here we go. Now if I were to click, and oh right, I should also pass in the actual count itself. So I can pass in the count as a prop as well. And you'll see here that I'm able to pretty much do this just like that. Now, for the purposes of our tutorial, just because I want simple enough code to show you how Redux works, we're actually not going to do this, and we're going to do this through Redux instead. Now, this is a very simple example, and I'm doing this because I want to make it as easy as possible to understand how Redux works, and you could just more easily with less setup do it the way that I just showed you, but we're going to pretend that we want to use Redux for this, and our use case is going to be more complex, because when you get to more complex components like I showed you guys over here, you won't be able to do simple things like this, because you're going to have to span multiple components. You're going to be passing, components up and down the, parent child trees and stuff like that, and it doesn't get too fun. So let's go ahead and revert what we have back to the way it was. Let's go ahead and we can just go ahead and delete this, and then inside of our counter, we can go ahead and instead of getting all of this from props again, we can go ahead and uncomment this, and now we're back to exactly what I showed you guys at the beginning. So the first thing we're going to have to do is set up our Redux component essentially. The way you first do that is the first thing you got to do is you have to add what is known as a provider. Now, it's a bit confusing when you see how they do this on the Redux documentation, because they don't sort of give you a really good direction on how to do all of these things. But essentially the direction goes as follows. The first thing you do is you go to your index.js and you set up a provider. And if you remember our React Router videos, all a provider is it's something that wraps around your entire application, and everything that is a child of it, or a nested child of it, will be able to access any functions from it down the line. So I want all my components to be able to access a bunch of different Redux components and Redux hooks. And in order to do that, I have to first pass in the provider. So you're going to wrap your app call in index.js around with a provider. And this provider is going to come from the library React Redux. Now, this library is a really important one, and you need both React Redux and Redux. Even though we're only going to be pulling components from React Redux, you still need Redux because it uses Redux under the hood. And the reason there are two different ones is because Redux can be used without React as a whole. You can use Redux in any JavaScript application, but React Redux provides some really nice wrapped components that you can use that makes working in React with Redux so much easier, and we're going to be using that. So if you're on VS Code, just type in npm I React Redux, and it'll go ahead and install it. Now, once that it's installed, let's go ahead and import the provider from React Redux, and let's go ahead and wrap our application around in that provider. Bam. So you'll see here that we are getting an error that we can't read properly property get state of null. And the reason we're getting that error is because we need to first create a store and pass it in to our provider in order for it to work. So the second part of the initial setup, we are going to go ahead into source. We're going to create a new directory inside of the source folder, and we're going to call this directory Redux. Now in our Redux, we're going to create a file, and we're going to call that file configurestore.js. And then I'm also going to create in the Redux folder a directory called Dux, just like that. Now in our configure store, this is essentially what we are going to export for our app provider, for our provider that wraps around our app to use for the entire thing. And the purpose of this file is to take all the ducks that you have and any middlewares you would want to apply to Redux, and we'll talk about that in a second, and essentially add that into the store. So first of all, let's go ahead and import a couple of things. Let's import combine reducers, create store, all from Redux itself. Now, we're importing this from Redux because these are Redux core functions, and we are not wrapping them around in any JSX or whatever, so they don't come from React Redux. They will come from the Redux library itself. So now what we're going to do is essentially, all we're going to do is we're going to create a store, const store equals create store. And inside of this store, we're just going to pass in pretty much nothing. And then we're going to export default store. All right. And we're not using this combined reducers thing just yet. But let's go ahead and go to our app and let's import inside of here. We can go ahead and import store from /the Redux folder /configure store. And oh, whoops, we got to do this in index, right? So let's go ahead and import that in index. And inside provider, we're going to say store is equal to store. And this still won't work just quite yet. Oh, whoops, it looks like, let's see. Oh, we put an equal sign here by accident. And you'll still see that this won't quite work because we have to pass in some sort of reducer into this create store function. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our first reducer, and that is essentially going to be a duck. So what we can do is let's create a duck for our counter, and we are going to go into the ducks folder and we're going to create a counter.js in here. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our initial state. Now, our initial state, if you remember our diagram over here, is essentially going to be what gets stored in our state, but what we want the initial values of that to be. Now, we have a very simple counter app, and in that counter app, all we really want to store that we want all the other components to access from our Redux store is the count itself. So we're going to go ahead and say const initial state. We're going to make it a map, and we're going to say count is just equal to 0. Now we're going to create the actions. Now the two actions we want is pretty much increment state and decrement state, because those are the only two things. Those are the only two things that we're going to be doing with our count. So when you create an action, there are two things that you do. The first thing is you create the action name. And the way you do that is you create a variable and you make it equal to the string. So I'm going to create increment in all caps is the usual standard that you want to use for Redux name. And the string that it's going to be tied to is going to be, you could, for example, just name it increment. And the reason you make this a variable is because you're going to be using this below in a function. And you want to make sure, there's a lot of times where it can get tricky. You have a lot of different actions and you don't want the names to sort of get confused. And you're going to be using this string increment a lot. So to prevent you from, making a spelling error when you're using that increment string anywhere else, you store it as a variable and you just call that variable. So the next part of making an action is we are just going to make the function for it. and the function for it is just going to be equal to something simple like this. It's going to be a function that returns a map, and in Redux, all your functions, all your actions will be functions that return maps, and the type is going to be what the action is. And don't worry if you don't get it just quite yet. You'll see how it all comes together in the end. And for that type, we're going to use that increment variable that we set up over here. Now, the final thing we're going to do is we're actually going to implement the reducer itself, the thing that will actually go ahead and increment this variable. So what we're going to do, and we're going to export default this function, and this function is what we're going to be using in our configurestore. We're going to be passing in a couple variables here, and this is just going to be an unnamed function. So state is going to be equal to initial state. This is just saying that, listen, we're going to be passing in a state variable, and if that state variable is undefined, aka the application hasn't been started before, we're going to make it equal to whatever the initial state is, and then we're going to be taking in our action. And we're going to go ahead and make that a function. And then inside of here, we're going to have our switch, and this switch is essentially what is going to control what happens based on which action gets called. It will be action dot type. So this switch statement is just like an if statement based on what type the action is. So whether it's an increment or a decrement, it will do something different. So before we go ahead and fill this action in, let's go ahead and make an action for our decrement. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to call this decrement, and we're going to make this string equal to decrement. And then we're going to create a function. It's going to be the same as increment, but we're going to call it decrement, and we're going to pass in the type as decrement as well. So now, in this switch statement, we're going to have two cases. One is if we have the increment action, and then we can go ahead and choose what to do in here. Let's just return undefined for now. Oops. Let's go ahead and return undefined for now. And number two is what is going to happen in our decrement. And let's also just return undefined. Now, in here is where you are going to actually do your returning for the state. So in your return, if we have an increment action, what do we want to do? Well, we want to increment this count by 1. That's what incrementing is. So what we are going to return is we are going to return a state where everything in the state is the same other than our count. And our new count is going to be equal to whatever the state.count was plus 1. The reason we do it like this is because in regular applications, you might have a lot more variables in your state. Let's say I have like count, let's say I have like, I don't know, like name, and let's say we have like, ID, and that ID is initialized to 0 or whatever. If we are doing an increment action, all we care about is incrementing the count. When we return something here, it will completely overwrite the state with whatever you put in here. So if I were to just put in a map with, count, well, that would make it so the new state would just be count is equal to whatever the count would be, which is why we have to go ahead and we have to spread all the variables from the state that we are getting passed in, and then after that, we add our new count. So when it returns this, the new state will be equal to everything that's already inside of the state, as well as our count that is being overwritten. Now, you can pause the video and try to think of what the decrement's going to look like. I'll give you a second to do that. But essentially, the decrement's going to look the exact same, except instead of state.count minus 1, or plus 1, it's going to be state.count minus 1. And let's get rid of this old return function. So now our reducer is set up, and all we have to do in this configurestore is we are going to go ahead and we are going to import our reducer that we just made. So we're going to import, and we're going to call this, for example, counter reducer. I like to call this reducer name by whatever we gave it in our ducks. So this duck is called counter, and then append reducer to it. And we're going to import it from that folder, duck/counter. And then we are going to go ahead and we are going to say const reducer, is going to be equal to combined reducers. And what this is going to do, the reason we do combined reducers is because we might have more than one reducer. So we have, a reducer, a duck for our counter, and we would store things like the count state variable in there. And we might have actions like increment and decrement in there. But what happens if my application is no longer just a counter? Maybe a counter is a small part of that application, and another part of that application is storing a user, and inside of that user they will have an ID and stuff like that. Well, we don't want to store everything inside of one duck, one reducer, because by the time we have an actual application, we're going to have a ton of different state variables, a ton of different actions, and if you store everything inside of one duck, it's going to get way too crowded. There's going to be way too many actions, way too many state variables, and way too many reducer switch cases that you're going to have to do. And eventually your file gets up to like 500 lines type of thing. So when you want to create a new, reducer for something different, like let's say, for example, our application handled users, we would create a new reducer for that. And that reducer would hold, the state variables of the user, like the user ID, the username, blah, blah, blah. Now, the reason we use this combined reducers is because if we have multiple reducers, we would list all of the reducers inside of here. So fortunately for us, we only have one reducer, so we're going to call it counter, and we're just going to link to our defaulted export over here, just like this. Now, at our create store, we can go ahead and we can pass in our reducer. Bam. And now passing in this reducer, let's go ahead and refresh this. It looks like we broke something with code sandbox. Counter is return undefined for initialization. Oh, I think we might have to give it a let's see. So let's debug a little and see what we went wrong with. So reducer equals counter is a function that returns a map, and that has counter reducer in here that we are importing. That all looks good. Reducer counter return undefined during the initialization. Oh, right. We need to have a, sorry about that. We need to have a default, case for our switch statement. So see here, right now it's going to return undefined because when it first gets run, it's returning none of these cases are hitting. We're not dispatching an increment or a decrement call. We have to have a default in our switch case, and that default is just going to return the state. And remember, state is being initialized to initial state. We go ahead and remove all this stuff. Initial state when we first run it, and there we go. So nothing is going to look different functionally, but behind the scenes, we've actually done a lot. We have set up this entire Redux store and Redux structure, and now we can go ahead and start using it. So let's have some fun and start using this thing. So the first thing I'm going to do is over here, inside of this counter component, I'm going to get rid of the state variable count and set count. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all of this. And now we're going to get a bunch of errors because number one, count is undefined. And number two, even if it was defined, these buttons are not calling anything. So we're going to do two things. Number one is we're going to get the count variable from our Redux store. And number two, we're going to get our counter to dispatch an action that will increment and decrement the count. It's going to dispatch the action that we set up over here. So over here, we're going to go ahead, and the first thing we're going to do is, in order to read a variable from our Redux store, we have to use a hook called useSelector. And if I were to type in useSelector here, you will see that it automatically imports it from React Redux. And essentially what we're going to do is we're just going to say const count. It's going to be equal to useSelector. And in this hook, it pretty much has an automatic parameter that it passes in called state. And you are going to just find the variable you want as following. You go to state, and then at the first thing you want to destructure from state is, not destructure, but get out of state, is the reducer that the variable you want is inside of. Now, if you remember from configurestore, we only have a single reducer set up, and that is the counter reducer. But we can go, so we'll go ahead and get the counter reducer, and then out of that reducer, we want just the variable from that reducer that we want. let's go to the counter duck, and we can see here that the variable we want is just called count. Bam, just like this. And then I'll go ahead and save, and let's go ahead and refresh this. Whoops. And you will see here the count is equal to 0. And obviously the buttons don't work yet because we haven't hooked up our increment and decrement function. But if I were to come and I were to set this initial state to, let's say, have the count be 5, you'll see if I refresh it, bam, the count gets changed to 5. This counter is now reading the count from our Redux store. Now let's go ahead, let's make the count back to 0 again. And let's go ahead and let's add an increment function in here. So in this increment function, all we want to do is we want to dispatch an increment action, because when we dispatch an increment function, it will asynchronously dispatch it. Our Redux provider that's running in the background will pick up the action and do whatever the reducer says to do with it. And in this case, the reducer says we should keep everything in the state the same other than the count, and the count will be the count plus 1. So let's go ahead and do that. To do that, we have to use another hook called useDispatch. And by the way, we're using all these hooks to get Redux to work with us. But before the era of hooks, back in the days where you just had class components, the setup for this was so much harder. You had to do so many different things just to get Redux working, and it was so much more complex. So we really are living in sort of a golden age of React and Redux using functional components and things like hooks. I can't even tell you. If you really want to know, I have a couple of old videos that I've done on setting up Redux with React. You can go over there and see what a nightmare it used to be, but man, it is so much nicer now, and we're living the good life. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const dispatch is going to be equal to, and we're going to use this useDispatch hook that comes from React Redux, and we're just going to initialize our dispatch function. And this dispatch function will allow us to call any functions that our Redux store, our duck has. So I can't just call this increment function regularly because it would just be calling the function. If I wrap it around in dispatch, what that does is it tells the Redux listener in the background, hey, I want to dispatch an action of this type. Please do whatever it entails. And in this case, it entails incrementing. So let's go ahead and yeah, so we've gone ahead and we've created our dispatch function. Now in increment, all we're gonna do is we're gonna dispatch, and then I'm gonna go ahead and, what was the name of our function here? Increment. Increment. Okay, so it's a bit weird. So because this function in this component is also called increment, so I'm gonna rename this like do increment or handle increment. That's I think a bit more standard. And then this one will be handle decrement. Let's go ahead and replace that for the buttons. Okay, and now we're going to dispatch increment, and that increment we're going to import it from our duck, and inside of our decrement we're going to go ahead and dispatch decrement. Bam, we're going to automatically import that from our duck as well. All right, let's see if that works. No, so it doesn't work. Actions must be plain objects. Use custom middleware for async options. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at what we did wrong. Oh, right, we have to actually call the function in here. So we have to pass in the we have to actually call the function, not just pass in a reference to the function. So let's go ahead and save that. And hopefully, if you get that error, you now know how to solve it. If I click increment, bam, there we go. Now it is completely incrementing and getting the thing all in our Redux store. So let's go ahead and do what our initial goal was, which was to store the count inside of our, or to display the count from inside of our app component. So we can go ahead and delete the count from here. We can cut, so this code that actually gets the count from here, we can go ahead and cut this. We can go ahead and move that. And then we're going to come back, and over here in app, we're going to do the same thing that we did over here in counter to get this variable. Now this is where things come easy, because now I want to use that count variable inside of this component, and it becomes super easy. I just go ahead and go ahead and declare it, and I'll have to import the useSelector same way. And now all of a sudden, I can go ahead, pass in count into this, and bam. Now I am incrementing the count from one component, and it is showing up in the other component. And this is so convenient. It is awesome. I love Redux for this reason. Now, I promised at the beginning of this video that I was going to show you a more complex example of this, and I'm still going to do that. If you just wanted to see how to set up Redux and everything and use this code as an example, you can pretty much stop here, but I'm going to show you a bit more complex. And then in the next videos, I'm going to get even more complex, adding more things like more reducers and making a more complex application with this. But what if I wanted a count and I wanted that count? This is going to be pretty weird, but like, let's say I wanted each count to have a vote. And each count would represent, let's say, a different person. And I wanted this to display the total count, and I wanted to keep the local like vote count for each person over here. So what I'm going to do is, number one, let's go ahead and what I can do here is in counter, let's say in props, I also passed in a person's name. So let's say const like name equals props. And then over here, I'm just going to display, you know, like in paragraphs tags like their name. Okay. Or let's make it like an H2. Okay. And over here, when I call the counter, I'm going to say something like name equals Anthony. Anthony Sistili. That's my name. Right. Oh, whoops. What am I doing? Gotta pass that in as a string. Okay, cool. So we can see here Anthony Sistili. And let's say I wanted another count for, let's say, like Bob Smith. And then like Stephanie like Fu or something. So you can see here I have a bunch of different counters, and let's go ahead and refresh this. The count is 0. When I increment the count for Anthony, the count over here increases. And when I increment it for Bob, it also increases. So our Redux store is sort of acting like a total count. And I can even change this. Let's change this to total count. And now I want to show, I also want to have maybe a local count in here. So I want to see how many vote or total, let's call this total votes. And then I know like I'm changing the variable name up, but that's just for the sake of the example. I can go ahead and I can create a, in our counter, let's go ahead and create a state variable. So const like, you know, votes, set votes is going to be equal to react.useState. And we're going to set their votes initially to 0. And when we increment, not only are we going to, you know, increment the count that, sorry about that, we have in our actual Redux store, but we're also going to increment their votes. So we're going to set votes just to be votes plus 1, the same way that we had it before. Let's go ahead and do that. And then over here, we're going to do votes minus 1. And now let's just go ahead and display their votes. So like in an H6, we're going to say like, you know, votes, and then we're going to display their votes. Oops. Bam. Okay, H6 is a bit small, so let's make it an H3. Make it a bit bigger. Here we go. So now I can go ahead and increment Anthony Sistili's votes. But when I increment Bob Smith's votes, you'll see Anthony Sistili votes is still 3. But the total votes, so if Bob Smith has 10 votes and Anthony Sistili have 3 votes, you can see the total votes is now 13. And if I decrement it, it'll work the same. And if I give Stephanie a bunch of votes, you'll see it increments it. So this is a cool little example. If you want, we can even go ahead and you know, clean this up a bit. And if you want, this is a cool little React exercise. If you can think of a way to clean up instead of having to call this counter component over and over again, I'll give you a second to think about it. But one way we can clean it up is just say like we can make a array called like voters, and you know, we can have just their names like Anthony Sistili. And this is now nothing to do with Redux, but just a little cool React exercise. Stephanie Fu, and I can even add like, you know, like Kevin Ma. And then instead of like, you know, having a different counter component for every single one of these 4 people, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through our, and let's name that lowercase. I'm just going to go through my voters.map, voter, and I'm just going to return counter, where the name is just going to be equal to voter. Bam, just like that. So that way we don't have to call the counter component a million times. Like if we had like 30 different voters, I wouldn't want to copy and paste counter in the JSX. I can just do it like this. And we've gone over mapping before, but yeah, that is pretty much it. And I'll go ahead and refresh this. Sometimes on Code Sandbox, the Redux store gets a bit finicky. If I were to like, you know, give it a bunch of votes and then change something, just like that, and save it, you'll see that the React, let's go ahead and like, let's add like Paul or something. You'll see that like sometimes the React store gets a bit finicky with Code Sandbox. But anyways, that is it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a comment if you found value. It helps the YouTube algorithm so much. I can't even tell you guys how much it helps. And yeah, Code Sandbox link. Feel free to play around with this. Feel free to use this as like sort of your go-to way of how to set up a Redux project. I always go back to one of my projects as a reference on how to set up a Redux store whenever I start a new project, and it's just really useful. So I hope you're all staying safe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.